speech describing Washington and Tel Aviv as the best of friends.
America and Israel are more than friends. We're like a family.
Yet the welcome the Prime Minister received was far from cordial. Angry protesters rallied outside as the Prime Minister spoke, and police forcefully dragged demonstrators right out of the building. Netanyahu spoke before Congress to condemn a possible deal with Iran over its nuclear program, and Netanyahu certainly wasn't holding back.
We must all stand together to stop Iran's march of conquest, subjugation, and terror. Iran and ISIS are competing for the crown of militant Islam. One calls itself the Islamic Republic, the other calls itself the Islamic State. This regime will always be an enemy of America.
You can tell his speech there met with a standing ovation inside the Congress, yet many lawmakers were far from happy. 57 senators, mostly Democrats, chose to boycott the address. Among those to snub the speech, the American president himself, Barack Obama.
On the core issue, the Prime Minister didn't offer any viable alternatives.
Frankly, I came away from the speech disappointed. Why would a friend of America act this way towards the president?
Indeed, it was political theater, worthy of an Oscar.
And had not one word about what he would do any differently. He's lecturing us about how we ought to conduct ourselves in the future.
At the time Netanyahu was addressing Congress, the U.S. Secretary of State was busy meeting his Iranian counterpart for more talks on the nuclear issue. An array of challenges still remain ahead of the end of March deadline for Iran to agree to cuts to its atomic program in exchange for a lifting of sanctions. And former diplomat Hillary Mann Leverett, who used to negotiate with Iran, she believes the Israeli Prime Minister's speech could actually push Obama into closer cooperation with Tehran.
It certainly is a shot across the bow for the Obama administration. It will, I think, make things more difficult for the Obama administration here domestically in the United States, but it has the potential to accelerate movement on negotiations with Iran because Prime Minister Netanyahu has really backed President Obama into a corner. He has no place to go. President Obama can't just wake up tomorrow and say, oh, I didn't realize that Iran was part of the evil Islamist conspiracy that Prime Minister Netanyahu outlined before Congress. Now that I know that, I'm no longer going to negotiate with Iran for a diplomatic agreement. So it really puts President Obama in a corner and I think potentially accelerates progress on negotiations with Iran.
And the Israeli Prime Minister angered many at home. Tens of thousands hit the streets of Tel Aviv to protest against their government's policies. The marchers called for the focus to be on domestic social policies and for a change on security and foreign policies. The rally, called Israel Wants Change, was held just over a week before a general election, which could see Netanyahu entering the office for a fourth term. Still to come here on RT International, the confusion surrounding MH17. Ukrainian media claim the plane was shot down by a Russian missile, citing Dutch prosecutors. They tell us, though, they've reached no such conclusion. Also,
what you're viewing on the internet is not what we're interested in.
An Australian minister struggles to explain a new government initiative on internet surveillance. That full story just ahead.
Мина, 9 этаж, пробила крышу. Есть, жгут наложили? Все наложили. Дима, кали. Время уже пошло.
Взяли. Скажи маме, у меня массовые поступления, я задерживаюсь на работе.
У нас больной.
Быстро, давайте, бомбежка начинается, давайте.
Вы меня слышите? Как вас зовут?
Часы скуки меняются мгновениями ужаса.
Это про нас.
Это про нас.
Thanks for sharing your Sunday with us here on RT International. Headlines like these were all over the Ukrainian media, stating Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down by a Russian Buk missile. No maybe, no perhaps, it's all reported as fact. The source supposedly comes from the Dutch prosecutor's office. The Netherlands is leading the investigation into the crash that killed almost 300 people who were on board. Now, it appears they used, for example, this article here by a Dutch broadcaster titled 5 Questions About MH17. You scroll down, here it is. What have the police and prosecutors found so far? It says here that the Boeing was brought down by a Buk missile fired from a Russian launcher and probably by the Russian military. But here's the problem. Dutch prosecutors told us here at RT International they have reached no such conclusion.
I'm not familiar with these reports, but I can say for sure that they are not correct. We are still investigating the plane crash. We are not yet ready to take any conclusion.
And the U.S. has joined in with new accusations against Russia over its alleged involvement in the East Ukraine conflict. But no definitive satellite images or even ground photographs of any alleged invasion has accompanied any of the allegations. Here's Guy Chichikan.
Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland has launched a rhetorical assault.
Russia and its separatist puppets have unleashed unspeakable violence and pillage. Hundreds and hundreds of Russian heavy weapons and troops have poured across the border. A commercial airliner was shot down this summer.
When thrown together like this, all of these points go unchallenged. MH17 was shut down, but there is still ongoing investigation, and there's no indication that Russia has shut it down. But from the way Ms. Nuland put it, it seems that Russia has. With regard to the statement about Russian heavy weapons and troops in Ukraine, Russia has repeatedly asked the U.S. and NATO to present proof of that, other than some dark patches from a satellite picture. Also, the OSCE monitors have said that they have never observed any crossing of military equipment at the border crossing points that they monitored. So a lot of questions here. Victoria Nuland has sought to put the responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine entirely on Russia's shoulders.
We have made clear that Russia is responsible for fueling this war in eastern Ukraine.
There was no mentioning of the fact that it started when Ukraine's elected leader was overthrown as a result of violent protests at Maidan, and the fact that the U.S. played an important role in this.
The protests in the Maidan and Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine.
One rare voice at this hearing has asked if peace in Ukraine is really the goal of the U.S. government.
I would hope that our goal is to do what's right by Ukraine and bring peace to Ukraine, and not our goal being to basically defeat and humiliate Russia. Because if that's our goal, the people of Ukraine will continue to suffer and suffer and suffer.
Now that there is finally some chance to make peace in Ukraine, the majority of U.S. lawmakers, as well as some members of the Obama administration, are pushing to send weapons to Ukraine. So at this point, one can ask, who is really fueling the conflict in Ukraine? In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chakyan, RT.
And amid the international blame game over that conflict, a coal mine in the East Ukrainian city of Donetsk was hit by a deadly blast on Wednesday morning. 34 miners were killed and over a dozen injured in the explosion. And the local emergencies ministry said the blast was caused by a buildup of methane. Our correspondent Murad Gazdiev is at the scene there of the tragedy. I should warn you before we get to his report, it does contain graphic images.
What was once one of the deadliest coal mines in the USSR hasn't become any less dangerous with age. Since the late 90s, more than 300 Ukrainian miners have lost their lives in its tunnels, many of them now buried at its gates. Funeral followed by funeral.
This is another mother of the killed miners, one of the killed miners. And as you can see, she's obviously distressed, in shock, trying to cope with her loss. And she's being consoled by psychiatrists. As callous as this may sound, Minor deaths are not a rarity in these parts, and over the years they've learned to say the right thing when it needs to be said to help people deal with their loss.
Miners and their families all know the risks, but that doesn't make it any easier.
Such a tragedy is always a shock for families and relatives. You can't prepare for it. And now they need psychological help. The faster it is given, the quicker they recover.
The events of the day were emotionally draining, even for just observers. But in this tragedy, there was some cause for joy. Ivan was one of the miners caught in the blast.
There was a bang, and all the lights went out. The wires were obviously torn apart. I managed to crawl out of there by myself.
Even at the onset of the rescue operation, miners told us that they doubted anyone else would be found alive. But that didn't stop them from volunteering to help.
This is our job. Do you understand? We can't leave them there. No matter how dangerous, we will try to find them. This is our duty. We will go down there until the end, if it makes it easier for others.
Ivan is now out of intensive care and recovering, watched over by his wife.
My father was a miner, and my grandfather too. That's normal here in Donbas. Most of the people here are somehow tied to mining.
And so they are. The region is a global leader in coal mining. Even the conflict hasn't stopped the digging. But I asked Ivan whether he would return to the mines after everything.
No, honestly, I just want to work as a tractor driver. Honestly, it's a long-time dream of mine, to sit atop a tractor with clean air blowing into my face.
Morad Gazdiev, RT, in Donetsk, eastern Ukraine.
And lined up for you right now at RT.com, ladies with altitude. Daring girls from the Russian Airborne Military School had to carry out several parachute jumps and even pass combat training to just become liaison officers. You can watch their first dives right now at RT.com. And a plunge into the deep, one of the largest and most technologically advanced warships ever built, discovered at the bottom of the sea.